the rancher had not meant to stop that morning, not really. His truck slowed only because the road dipped near the old irrigation ditch, the same ditch he'd crossed for 20 years without thinking, but something about the way the woman was crouched there made his foot ease off the gas, the way her shoulders curved inward as if she were trying to fold herself smaller than the world allowed, and before he knew it the truck was idling and dust was settling around the tires like a held breath, and he watched from behind the windshield as she scraped the last bits of food from a torn paper sack into a cracked plastic bowl, her movements careful, almost reverent, like this was not scraps but something sacred, and then two children appeared from behind the weeds, thin as fence posts, eyes too big for their faces, waiting without a word, waiting the way children wait when they've learned that asking doesn't help, and the rancher felt something old and heavy stir in his chest, something he thought he'd buried with his wife years ago, something like shame mixed with memory, because he knew that look, he knew that silence, he had worn it once himself when he was a boy whose father worked land that never quite gave back enough, and he stayed there longer than he meant to, long enough for the woman to notice the truck and freeze, her hand tightening around the bowl as if she expected it to be taken from her, her chin lifting not in defiance but in a tired readiness for whatever judgment came next, and when she stood he saw how young she really was, too young to have lines carved so deep around her mouth, too young to look like hope had already passed her by, and the rancher opened his door and stepped out, boots crunching on gravel, the sound loud in the quiet, and he raised his hands slightly, not to scare her, and said he was sorry to interrupt, that he just wanted to ask if everything was all right, and she nodded too quickly, the way people do when they don't want questions, said yes sir, everything was fine, thank you, and turned back to the children, urging them softly to eat before the food got cold though it clearly already was, and the rancher saw then that the bowl held nothing but bread heels and greasy paper wiped clean with fingers that didn't want to waste even the smell, and he felt anger flare, not at her but at a world that let this happen within sight of his fences heavy with cattle and barns full of grain, and he cleared his throat and asked where she lived, and she hesitated just a moment before pointing toward the cluster of abandoned trailers near the dry creek, the ones everyone pretended not to see, and something in her voice told him she expected him to tell her she couldn't be there, that the ditch was private land, that she needed to move along, and he surprised them both by nodding and saying all right, then turning back to his truck without another word, and she watched him go with a tight knot in her stomach, certain she'd misjudged him, certain that kindness was a mistake she could no longer afford, and yet when the engine faded she felt an ache she hadn't expected, because for just a second she'd allowed herself to hope, and the rancher drove back to his house with his jaw set and his mind louder than the engine, seeing again the way his mother used to water down soup so it would stretch, hearing her say eat slow, it lasts longer that way, and by the time he pulled into his driveway he had already made his decision, though he would not have put it into words if asked, because some things don't need naming to be true, and he walked straight past the house into the storage shed where baskets sat stacked from last harvest season, baskets meant for market days and church raffles, and he chose the biggest one, sturdy and wide, and began to fill it without counting, flour and rice, beans, and canned vegetables, fresh eggs still warm from the coop, apples with skins unbruised, bread that hadn't yet known the hardening edge of hunger, and last of all, he added a small jar of honey his wife used to love, the one thing that made him pause, because grief still had a way of ambushing him in quiet places, and he closed the basket, loaded it into the truck, and drove back down the road, dust rising again like a second chance, and when he reached the ditch the woman was gone, panic flickering in his chest until he saw the children's footprints leading toward the trailers, and he followed them not like an owner but like a guest, stopping short of the doorway so as not to intrude, and when he set the basket down and knocked, the woman opened the door with caution etched into every line of her body, and when she saw what he'd brought her knees nearly gave way, not because she wanted to cry in front of a stranger but because the weight of relief was heavier than the weight of despair she carried every day, and he said only this is for the kids, and maybe for you too, and when she tried to thank him he shook his head, said no need, really, and turned away before gratitude could become a debt, before words could cheapen what was meant to be simple, and she stood there long after he was gone, hands trembling as she lifted the lid, the children peering in with wonder like they'd stumbled upon treasure, and that night they ate until their bellies were full and then some, and the woman lay awake listening to their breathing even and deep, something she hadn't heard in too long, while miles away the rancher sat on his porch staring at the stars, telling himself it was nothing, just a basket, just a moment, yet knowing in his bones that some acts are quiet not because they are small but because they are meant to be, and if this story has already reached your heart, if you feel that pull to believe that kindness still exists in a loud and hurried world, the rancher never went back to that road on purpose, not in the days that followed, not because he regretted what he'd done but because he believed, deep down, that true kindness should never circle back to check its own reflection, and so life returned to its familiar rhythm, fences to mend, cattle to move, mornings that smelled of dust and coffee and evenings that settled heavy with silence, yet something had shifted inside him, a quiet loosening he couldn't quite explain, like a knot untied without him noticing the hands that did it. And miles away in the sagging trailer by the dry creek the woman woke each morning to a different kind of quiet, one where fear no longer shouted first, where the children laughed more easily, where meals had shape and color and not just the taste of survival, and she rationed carefully, stretching the food with the skill of someone who had learned necessity too young, but she no longer diluted hope, because the basket had done more than fill their stomachs, it had reminded her that she was still seen, that her children mattered in a world that so often looked past them, and she told them nothing about the men except that someone had helped and that one day they would help someone else, because gratitude, like kindness, grows best when it isn't trapped by obligation. And weeks passed and the rancher heard things in town, quiet things, the way rumors always arrived disguised as coincidence, someone mentioning that the kids near the creek were back in school, someone else saying the woman had taken a job at the diner on weekends, nothing dramatic, nothing that screamed miracle, just small steady steps forward, and each time he heard it he felt that same tightening in his chest, not pride, never that, but a kind of reverence for how fragile turning points really are, how easily they can be missed. And one afternoon months later a letter appeared in his mailbox with no return address, the handwriting uneven but determined, and inside were only a few lines, no names, no explanations, just words that said your basket carried us through winter and into spring, my children sleep without hunger now, I won't forget what you gave even if you never want thanks, and he folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer where his wife's things were kept, because some gratitude deserves the company of love that has already proven itself. And time continued its work, seasons shifting, calves growing, fences repaired again and again, and the rancher aged the way land does, slowly, honestly, with wear that speaks of use rather than neglect, and one summer evening he passed that same road and noticed wildflowers blooming near the ditch, bright and stubborn, and he smiled without knowing why, while far away the children ran through sprinklers behind the diner, laughing with mouths full and hearts light, unaware that their lives had pivoted on a moment a stranger chose not to look away. And if this story has stayed with you, if it reminds you that even the smallest quiet kindness can echo for years, then don't let it end here. Subscribe to this channel, because stories like these deserve to be carried forward, shared, remembered, and the next one may be exactly what someone else needs to believe again.